Hello, I'm Matt Kelly.
And I'm Matt Dancona.
And this is the Two Matts for the week ending Friday, the 26th of April, the podcast that celebrates St. George's Day in the traditional manner. Didn't we, Matt? Did we?
Not really, but it's a nice.
Is it traditional to interview two authors?
I think it is, and what authors? So we had our friend Tom Baldwin, who we had the other day to talk about his Starmer biography. He's written another book. Tom is a very distinguished journalist, and he was director of comms for the Labour Party and just written this book on Keir Starmer. And his friend and colleague Marc Stears has co-authored this book on England, and Marc is. He's now the director of the UCL Policy Lab. He was a professor at Oxford before, and he was also chief speechwriter to the Labour Party. So they're a high-powered pair, and they've written this book about England and what it means. And they've been travelling around, and we had an absolutely fascinating chat with them.
We did. It's called England: 7 Myths That Changed a Country and How to Set Them Straight. And
out this week.
It's out this week, and I think listeners will find the chat really, really fascinating. Actually,
they have a very interesting and original take.
Yes.
On the subject,
and also how it may impact a Labour government in the future.
Yeah, it's very topical and very contemporary, so we recommend it, and we enjoy talking to them.
Yeah, so tune in now for our discussion about what England and Englishness means. This is the Two Matts, episode 42. Enjoy. So, Marc, Tom, welcome to the Two Matts.
Welcome to the Two Matts. Congratulations on the book. We're recording this on Thursday, which I believe is publication date.
Today.
Hearty congratulations. It's a fascinating book, and I really do commend it to listeners of the podcast. And I want to ask sort of a few basic preliminary questions. One is that you, in addressing the issue of England, you structure it around 7 cities and 7 myths, which struck me as a very imaginative way of doing it. But I wondered how you got to that approach, how you adopted that strategy.
I think almost accidentally initially. Marc was in Australia. Marc had managed to move from South Wales to New South Wales, as we say. I was walking around, I was trying to sort of work out how we're going to do this book, and it was during lockdown. I went for a walk to Runnymede, where Magna Carta was sealed in 1215. It was so striking because all these new monuments had sprouted up since 2015, since certain aspects of politics had decided to make Magna Carta a huge thing again. And you realise the places and the monumental architecture around them almost embody the myths and show how the myths are the varying relevance of the myths at different times. And so, then I went to Plymouth and saw this vast amount of architecture and street names and different monuments and different statues for Drake. And you see how these different places are so tied up with the myths, but also that the people living within them aren't necessarily living the myth. They're living their lives. And that contrast between the ordinary life and this grandiose, engorged myth really struck me. So we then sort of tried to sort of fit these different myths to different places, and we came out with the structure.
And Marc, one of the interesting things about the book as well is that most sort of attempts to characterise a place or an idea nowadays aim at it's like a stock, reducing a stock to a simplification process. But you both seem to almost set out to look for nuance and ambiguity and to deflate the simplistic myths. So again, was that a conscious choice, or did it come as you were?
So as Tom said, we started writing the book in a really weird way, which is, it was lockdown. I was in Australia, Tom was here, and so what we started to do is we had sort of Zoom calls with people all over the country, sort of famous people and not famous people, older and younger, richer and poorer, and tried to get a picture of what folks thought about England at the moment, and in those initial Zooms, it was extraordinary because this theme of sort of mix and muddle and complexity and nuance just like came through all of the conversations, even with conversations with people like Michael Gove, who you might not associate that with, whose public persona might be sort of very either angry or grandiose or sort of big and booming. You actually get people to reflect on what England is. They very quickly go to the mix and muddle, and that kind of Tom and I just reflected on that right from the start then, which is okay, if we're going to try and give a picture of the country, it's going to have to start from that nuanced, much more complex place.
Well, let's take one of the places. I mean, you mentioned it, Tom, Runnymede, and especially for a lot of conservatives who fancy themselves as libertarians, it's a great sort of symbol of Magna Carta and libertarianism, and this rather imagined narrative that says that the 1215 document signed by King John was the origin of basically when the day that liberty was invented. Talk us through how that's not true and the consequences of it not being true.
I think most people would accept the story of Magna Carta as a flawed one. If you ask people what Magna Carta meant, I think the answer has varied significantly over the last 800 years, from sort of getting concessions to catch fish on the Thames and prevent Jews getting any, I can't remember quite what the clause is against Jews, but it's certainly nothing about liberty, to symbolising the Civil War, a kind of restoration of a sort of basic English set of rights which were never in the document, to then the Chartists picked it up in the 19th century as ordinary people's rights against the establishment and the power. Again, nothing to do with the document. And then it was cited by suffragettes. It became a symbol in the Second World War. But then you have this sort of period after the Second World War where Tony Hancock famously says, Magna Carta, did she die in vain? There's a sense of it, people realising that it's a complete myth, seeing through it all. And then, of course, we get the Eurosceptics in the noughties. So Dan Hannan writes this book, How We Invented Liberty.
Yeah.
And he talks about Runnymede as a place of a global seismic event happened.
It was sort of the Manhattan Project of freedom, wasn't it?
Yeah. And the reason why they wanted to do that is because they had this conception of exceptionalism, of a sort of Anglo-Saxon birthright of liberty that we had invented. We need to take no lessons from foreigners. Indeed, the European Court and the Human Rights Act is a threat to this kind of liberty. And David Cameron, who really should have known better, was playing into this. I think we describe in a book he's sort of fumbling around a Eurosceptic erogenous zones with a speech on the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, with Spitfires flying overhead and the Queen in front of him, every single symbol of Englishness you could have. And he's saying that the Human Rights Act is a threat because he's playing games with that. And it's the politicisation of these myths. I don't really mind a story about Magna Carta. It's a great story. I like the cartoon version with King John and the hissing snake. It's great. It's when these things become inflated that they get in the way, and distorted, so that it's not relevant to the future of liberty in this country. To think that we invented it is actually, I think the kind of conception of freedom we found in Runnymede is a much better one. Yeah. It's about going for a walk on a drizzly Sunday afternoon and worrying about whether you should buy a scone at the National Trust cafe. Yeah. It's so boring that you can take liberty for granted. That's liberty. That's our English expression of it. And I think that to be able to take it for granted is to be very free indeed, rather than being obsessing about who invented it and trying to sever all our links with continental Europe.
Did you discover on your travels around the country then, did you discover anything that was defining England and Englishness? What did you conclude?
The best that we came up with is this idea of sort of mix, muddle and everydayness. I mean, the Runnymede story is really brilliant because Tom, when he went, and I was in Australia and he went wandering off during lockdown to have a look around Runnymede, he bumps into people looking at the monuments and they've got this sort of what I think is an extraordinary English response to them. They kind of think they're a bit ridiculous, a bit absurd. They know it's all kind of made up. But, it's, as Tom says, it's nice to have a little Sunday stroll. They enjoy the sort of quiet, they enjoy the countryside, and they are quite happy to kind of rub up against each other. And, that's what we kept on coming across, is that actually the vast majority of English people, when they think about the country, don't like bombast or puffed upness or claims of exclusivity or being the best in the world. They're almost at the opposite end. They're kind of a little bit melancholic, just getting on with it and sort of enjoying it for what it is. And we did some polling with the polling company More in Common recently, just when the book came out, to check in whether that's actually what people feel. And it's remarkable. It's like, the vast majority of people, they don't want to turn their backs on the past. They're not interested in fighting a kind of culture war, but neither do they think that the past symbolises, sort of a moral mission which is greater than any other country in the world. It's just not who we are.
Yeah, and I'm interested to know, was the feeling of Englishness represented equally or not equally throughout the places you visited? Do we feel more English in certain places than others?
I think some people, in terms of what Englishness has come to mean, yes. Because I think during Brexit and the years after, there was lots of polling evidence, and Rob Ford does this very well in his book Brexit Land, showing that people who identified as English were more likely to vote for Brexit, were more likely to be concerned about immigration. What we're trying to do is not sort of reclaim one version of Englishness, but say there isn't one version, and that's sort of the point.
Right.
It is in that muddle, in that, the fact that, everyone in this room has probably got a slightly different sense of Englishness that is actually very English. And rather than just recognise the muddle, we think we should embrace it, because in that muddle is a genius. That's where we become most creative. That's where the most brilliant things happen in this country, rather than trying to impose one-size-fits-all grandiose versions of this country, which were never true in the first place and have got no guide to where we go in the future.
Right.
I thought one of the most interesting sort of takedowns of the myths was in the chapter on Blackpool, because the idea of the sort of homogenous white working class has been such an important kind of dynamic in recent politics, and you really deconstruct. Can you tell us why it's wrong?
Well, I think the idea of there being a white working class vote is as wrong as there being a Muslim vote or a black vote.
Yeah.
Right? There are white working class people, and they're all different. I mean, who'd have thought it, right?
Yeah.
And
now you put it like that.
We've got, and the trouble with the debate is, you have all these focus groups and polls, and Labour are losing the support of the white working class, and they're all voting for Boris Johnson. And if you really look at the polling, the real party of the white working class is no party. They don't vote. They've turned their backs on politics, but that's not all of them, of course. And this is kind of caricature. So we went to the end of the peer shows, and there's these appalling comics, who me as a North London liberal was outraged about. And they were saying, I'm not going to repeat some of the things they're saying, but it was, in fact, there was a couple having sex in the theatre 2 rows in front of me, which I've never seen before in a theatre, until security arrived anyway. And the danger is we use that caricature of the white working class, say this is what they are, and we've got to listen to them because they've become really important in politics, and we end up with policy made by Roy Chubby Brown.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's not who they are. It's not who. It's how they're going along to be shocked. Most of the audience. There's lots of decency and love and tenderness on display in Blackpool. Lots of care. That's as much of who the white working class are as Roy Chubby Brown.
Yeah.
And I was outraged by what Roy Chubby Brown said, rightly. I think lots of the people in the audience went to be shocked. What we don't do is take that outrage, say, that's who they are, and empower a kind of caricature parody of the white working class, and elevate it up into a form of politics.
Isn't it also true, though, that Roy Chubby Brown is part of Englishness? I mean, I can remember since I was a school kid, Roy Chubby Brown jokes being told and being for that shock purpose. Even then they were, beyond the pale, and that was the whole point of him. But there is something, we can't just push all that to one side and say, well, that's exceptional. It's not. It's part of English.
No, that's right. But I think the key is that it's a part, and what politics has done is it's sort of concentrated it down. So so you're absolutely right that there are elements of these myths which you see in everyday life, like the Roy Chubby Brown one, and they are real and they have been around for a very long time, but they've been turned into the sort of essence of Englishness by these myth-making politicians who want to say it's that and it's that alone, and that's the real thing, that's the authentic thing, and everything else is just rubbish. So, white working class voters who vote for the Labour Party or don't vote for anybody who are completely turned off by GB News or by Reform are suddenly described as not white working class anymore. It's just like the stereotype, this kind of form of identity politics that we've generated. And I think that's what we see in all of the myths, is that elements of truth, elements of fun, elements that we wouldn't want to get rid of because they are enjoyable stories to tell. But the problem is when you distill them down, concentrate them, and say that's the essence of Englishness and nothing else counts.
Did you encounter any parts of the world I'll prefix this by describing Liverpool, because I grew up in Liverpool in the 70s and 80s, where there was a disassociation from England, almost literally driven by the Thatcher government, who was saying, let's run the place down. Geoffrey Howe wrote a memo to Thatcher saying, let's just manage decline. So growing up in Liverpool, the last thing you felt was English. You felt European, you felt Scouse, definitely. But, you were encouraged by the government, by Westminster, to feel alienated from England. And I wonder, has that healed completely, or is it? I think
we almost see the opposite now, which is that I think of all the places we visited in the book where that sort of distance from England and Englishness is strongest is probably London. So you talk to young people in London and you say, how do you identify? And most of them start by saying they're a Londoner. And then if you say, okay, well, what about the country? Then most of them go straight to Britain. And then they might go to Europe and they might go to the world. And so England doesn't feature in their self-description very much because they've come to see Englishness as wrapped up in these nostalgic myths or myths of the white working class or sort of Eurosceptic myths of liberty, etc. And they think, kind of Englishness isn't for me anymore. But really interestingly, we gave a talk on the book a couple of days ago, and at the end, a guy in his early 20s came up and said, I've never thought of Englishness or England before, but now I'm hearing all these stories. I recognise it is part of my identity. I just haven't wanted to acknowledge it as such because the only version available in public life or in political life doesn't appeal to me. But this subtler, more quieter, more complex picture, that's actually a true representation of who I am, and I'm kind of happy to be able to say that for now.
Right.
So you go to Wolverhampton, which was the site of Enoch Powell's, famous, notorious Rivers of Blood speech in '68.
He actually gave it in Birmingham. But,
he was in Birmingham.
He represented Wolverhampton.
But he represented Wolverhampton. My mistake. I mean, he himself, as you say, incarnated a certain kind of view of Englishness, a certain kind of racialized view of Englishness, which in a funny way, at the time, it created a crash barrier because it was, Heath sacks him, and that's the limit you cannot go beyond. And then suddenly, the beliefs he represented in a bowdlerized form re-emerge in the social media age, in the hands of Farage and others, and we are, to a certain extent, living with the consequences. I mean, I wouldn't want to go too far, but, a lot of powerlism is a lot of what we encounter as day-to-day politics. Now, what was the upside of the Wolverhampton experience that sort of takes that down, that myth, the myth of powerlism?
I think that's important because every chapter tries to, after deflating this myth, find some sort of essence of hope, measure of hope in the ordinariness of the place. And so one of the things that really struck me is I went with Pat Fadden, who's now a very important member of the Shadow Cabinet, to go to a Sikh temple in his constituency. And he warned me on the way. He says, they're going to have a go at me about car park. I went, really? And he went, yeah, that's all they ever talked to me about, the car park. They really was about the car park. I thought, well, this is quite interesting, because this is the city of Powell, and we've got Farage roving around the country, and we've got all this, and they're not talking about race relations. They're not talking about, violence on the streets. They're right about the car park. And there's a huge Church of England church which no one goes to. It's got a big car park that's now an antique centre, and they can't have that. So the Sikh temple wanted to get this little patch of park, but the council says they can't have that. And it's been going on for ages. And in the arcanity of a planning dispute about car parking, I think there's something really hopeful.
Healthy society negotiating a problem.
Well, there's no rivers of blood in that car
rivers
park.
Of car parks.
Yeah. And it is, it was something so English in its
Yes.
ordinariness. That I actually left feeling really optimistic, even though I'd had to listen to Pat McVan having to push back for an hour about,
On
well,
car
I'm not
parks.
going to promise you things I can't promise. But I've also, Pat's interesting in that, he's Scottish. He grew up in Glasgow. His parents were Irish and they spoke Irish at home. He represents a seat adjacent to Enoch Powell's in England now.
Yeah.
He's a pro-European. I think that sort of that multi-layered identity is really important to cities. And there's another great story from Wolverhampton in that football, which has always been something which exaggerates differences. I mean, why Wolves fans hate West Brom fans when they're both from the Black Country and look and sound exactly the same, I've never understood.
That's why.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, yeah.
And so, for a long time, football was a vehicle for the worst sort of racism.
Yeah.
When Barnes scored in the Maracana in Brazil, the National Front fans singing "We only won 1-0" because goals by black players didn't count, right? And now football has managed to transform itself. Not totally, there's still problems, but the work that the Wolverhampton Wanderers community program does is extraordinary, reaching out to different groups. It's now got this group of fans with the Punjabi Wolves who bring their doldrums to away games, and they got their own sections, and they're part of the Wolves club now, and recognised, and people are proud of them.
Yeah.
And I think that it's not about street theatre bringing people together. It's through recognisable, ordinary things which the whole city sees as being part of Wolverhampton, and everyone else is now part of it too. That's optimistic.
I mean, that's so crucial, I think, in the Wolverhampton story, is that it wasn't that the sort of absurdity of Powell's sort of racism and attempts at sort of English purity was replaced by a kind of utopian idyll of, multicultural diversity where everybody did street theatre and sort of, waved rainbow flags or what have you. It's that you have this negotiation through everyday institutions which enables people to learn to live with each other. And sometimes they really like each other because they support the same football team. Sometimes they're having an argument about where the car parks are. But the sort of mess and the mix and the muddle is the realistic way that a diverse community lives together, keeps on going, and that's what England is, and we ought to, not just sort of embrace it, but celebrate it for that.
Did you get a sense anywhere that sense of community, that street by street community, has eroded at all?
I think that's what we thought we would find, but I think we found more resilience than we imagined. So we go to Greenwich, to the Millennium Dome, or the O2 as it is now in a bit of the book, and I think we thought that we would find a sort of soulless part of London, which was all sort of shiny apartment buildings with no one living in them because they're all owned by Russian oligarchs, and sort of the old have been stripped out and replaced with sort of shopping malls and commerciality, etc. And there is some truth in that, but Tom was hanging out there chatting to people. You also see the emergence of a new kind of community life. So there are new community centres. There are teenagers hanging out, chatting to each other, making friends, going out with each other, planning the future as they always have. And it's almost like when you look at the Dome now, it's not a shiny white surface anymore. It's got little bits of lichen and moss and kind of
pattern.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what's happened to the neighbourhood as well. Is that sort of human relationships have started to grow again, and
There's a brownie pack there now.
Yeah.
And the shadow of the Millennium.
It was
Dome.
fascinating that. I mean,
Is that really?
Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah.
I found that chapter particularly interesting because it was the first sort of interrogation I've read of the kind of myth of modernity in the 90s, and we all lived through that, in the New Britain, and it was exciting, and I thought, that there's a point here, which is that you can't actually simply rest a governmental mission or a social order on a kind of everything must be new. It doesn't work, but it is and was very intoxicating, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Matt was talking about Liverpool, and Michael Hestine went up Liverpool. He didn't want Liverpool to be evacuated, but he did sort of want to raise large parts of it to the ground and build anew. The whole Albert, and Hestine was, of course, involved in the Dome. He was the first instigator of it before Tony Blair picked it up. And I think there's something, there was a big connection, I think, between Thatcher and Blair in this sort of modernity. I mean, Thatcher, of course, pretended that she represented Victorian values. I think we describe in the book as like sort of lavender-scented grandmother offering us cake
Laced with amphetamine. That's
thank
it. Yeah.
You got it. And you're right. It was exciting, but essentially it was vacuous, and there was a reaction to it. So I think there is a direct link between that ultra-modernity of the year 2000 and then the reaction when you had the sort of countryside alliance on the march.
Yeah.
The sense of something being lost. And I think you compare the opening of the Dome to the Olympic ceremony 2012. The Dome was... Can anyone remember what was in the Dome? I mean, it was all amorphous and sexless and weird and didn't really feel... There's some plastic pubic lice. What's that got to do with England?
Yeah, very weird, yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas the Olympic ceremony was an extraordinary muddle. It was like a sort of soup of different sorts of Englishness. You had the dancing nurses, and you had Morris dancers, and you had the Windrush, and
Mary Poppins whipping Voldemort,
and in that sort of dreamy sequence, people actually loved it.
Yeah.
And that was a moment when almost we captured a sense of the muddle of this country and liked ourselves for it.
Yeah.
And I think, the tragedy of that is I don't think we then moved on and try and build something more out of it.
So, retrospectors, what historical events are we ticking off on this week's run of Today in History?
Well, Monday is the anniversary of the day Roger first published his famous thesaurus.
Then on Tuesday we say happy birthday, Mr. Potato Head.
On Wednesday, the extraordinary stories of the child soldiers who fought in the American Civil War.
On Thursday, how King James changed the word of God.
And on Friday, what did spam emails look like in 1978?
We discuss this and more on Today in History with the Retrospectors. 10 minutes every weekday, wherever you get your podcasts.
This podcast, The Two Mats, is sponsored as ever by the New European newspaper. And we've got a very special subscription offer for you, a new one, where you can get a free Bollocks to Brexit passport cover. That's right, you heard that right, folks. It's a absolutely top quality burgundy, like vegan leather, beautifully designed passport cover. Pleather. That's what they call it, isn't it? Pleather. To hide your new British blue.
The shame of the blue.
The shame of the blue passport. And you can get your free Bollocks to Brexit passport cover free with, and it's worth £25, by the way, free with a subscription to the New European from just £1 a week. And for £1 a week, you get all of our digital content, including the new app, which we've just spent an absolute fortune redesigning and is really, really superb now. And
the least you can do is subscribe.
The least you can do is help us pay for that. Or for an extra £1 a week, if you like getting the newspaper delivered to your door, which I do very much.
Me too.
Every week we will send you first class post our award-winning newspaper, The New European, and that will be a saving of more than 75% on the retail price. So to take this fantastic offer, and trust me, if you like this podcast, you will absolutely love The New European, go to theneweuropean.co.uk/2mats. That's the number 2, MATTS, and there's a link in the show notes. How much is inequality part of Englishness? How much, vestige of the class system that we all grew up with and we now like to think has kind of eroded away? But how much of that is still kind of baked into Englishness?
Yeah, I mean, that comes across so powerfully, I think, in so many of the myths. I mean, many of the myths are designed to sort of hide the realities of inequality or class. That's what that you puff them up so much in the hope that you sort of obliterate the landscape underneath you, because the landscape is scarred by that kind of inequality. And I think we saw that most in our chapter when we went to Oxford to talk about the establishment. And again, there's so many sort of myths about the establishment. But the one, places like Oxford want to tell a story, which is that they represent the best of, England, and there's a sort of, they're an honest broker, or there's sort of, they protect us from sort of ravenous populism that might take place if they didn't have these established institutions. And as always, there's some truth in that. I mean, it is really important to have really great universities doing fantastic higher education, and they create opportunity, and they have done for a very long time. But there is also the remnants of that exclusivity and inequality, which is some people don't feel welcome, and that's because they're not yet fully welcome. We went for a wander around Oxford, and happened upon this sort of really lovely little church hall, which was having a kind of gathering of all the local charities and social enterprises and groups that do good work in Oxford. And essentially one side was all the university students and the other side was all the townspeople. And you could have been back in the 17th century. Like, they weren't talking to each other, they weren't working with each other. Tom very sort of normally went up to one of the student groups and said, who were working on issues of domestic violence. And they said, are you interested in domestic violence in the housing estates out in East Oxford as well as on campus? And they just said, no, of course not. We're the student society. That's what we do. Yeah. And look, they're not bad people. They're trying to do good things, but the sort of scope of what they do is still driven by some people being in, some people being out. Yeah. And I think we end that chapter on the establishment by saying, look, we need these institutions. They're absolutely vital. We don't want to smash them up like Dominic Cummings wanted to do, but they've got to connect again with the whole of society, and they've got to be genuinely open. They've got to be genuinely inclusive. Otherwise, they can't do the work that we need them to.
You also, in that chapter, obviously the fact that the last 4 prime ministers have been Oxford graduates is indicative of something, and you make the point that the one problem is that alternate routes to power, I think you use the phrase, as a silting up. So whatever happens in that university or Cambridge and or other Russell Group universities, that there's a sort of blockage on the diversity of routes to power that, oddly enough, there used to be. And I was intrigued about what you thought about that and what the answer to that is, or is that a whole other book?
I mean, it goes back a bit to the comedians of Blackpool.
Yeah.
Where, there used to be a great tradition of working class comedians coming up and getting TV shows. Now most of the comedians on TV are people who met at Oxford or Cambridge. They're sort of...
with a bit of Manchester University thrown in.
But pop music used to be working class, and middle classes saw that they're having a bit of fun, so they've taken that too. I mean, football was one of the few that haven't done that, because you can't go to university and be a Premier League footballer, it turns out. Sorry, lads. So there is a sort of sense that we're becoming more elitist, even as universities open up a bit more. There's another force going on as well, which I think is part of this dislocation with the establishment, which is the sort of globalisation of these institutions. So, Oxford has had a vast investment from people who have actually not got anything to do with the university. They're sort of washing their reputations quite a lot. You've got the Blacknick School of Government and the Stephen A. Schwartzman School of Humanities or whatever. And there's huge investment going on, which is not really related to the people they're meant to be educating there. When the sources of funding now are huge donations from individuals like that, alumni donations, putting on conferences, foreign students. Only number 5 is educating 18 to 21-year-olds from this country. And that dislocation between the university's core purpose and where its income sources are, I think is quite important. You're seeing it elsewhere. You're seeing it with the BBC is now trying to compete with Netflix rather than necessarily serve license fee payers. Yeah. And what we argue for is a sort of reconnection. And one of the best examples of that, I think, is the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine we had during COVID, which wasn't invented in some dreaming spire or one of these new shiny buildings paid for by some foreign billionaire. There's a really unfashionable part of Oxford up in Headington, in a building that looked like a sort of Holiday Inn, by a woman who has always struggled to get funding, and Dame Sarah Gilbert. And there's something about then how it's rolled out through dowdy NHS GP surgeries and health centres, rather than some sort of world-beating app, which again felt English to me. It felt there's more in the ordinary and more talent and creativity to be had in that than in the sort of so-called symbols of brilliance and wealth and power sometimes.
We're recording this in the week of St George's Day, and it was very interesting that Keir Starmer, subject of your biography, Tom, very good biography, went very hard on that. And it's not the first time he's sort of defined himself via patriotism, but it seemed to me reading this book that there was a lot of overlap in his approach. I mean, I think in your biography of him, you just have friends describing him as a small town patriot, something like that, which is at odds with his media image as being, the absolute archetype of the North London wokerati, lefty lawyer. You fill in as applicable. But it's interesting, isn't it, that what you've described here meshes quite a bit with what seems to be his worldview.
I think it is really interesting, and perhaps it's no coincidence that there is a kind of contiguity between the two books in that they're being written at the same time. But Starmer's message for St George's Day was significant because of the absence of some things that he could have talked about. He didn't have any of these grandiose myths. He wasn't talking about the invention of liberty or global Britain,
world leading, bombast.
He wasn't talking about how we fought the war on our own. He wasn't talking about a myth of modernity either. He was talking about rather ordinary things: service, the NHS, getting to the top of Scafell Pike with his very disabled mother, singing Free Lions at Wembley, supporting England, and meeting people. And I think there's something in his ordinariness which has the potential, and I would stress only potential, to work quite significantly in politics. If he gets the chance, and it's very difficult because politicians are always meant to be being forced to do other things and be other things, but I think his instincts are to sort of fit into the folds of this country rather than impose some idea upon it.
Right.
Like our sort of roads bend round hillsides rather than cut through them. Or, he's a lawyer, our common law system is based on precedent, and slowly some sort of jurisprudence emerges. And I think to the extent there is a sort of Starmerism, it's something that evolves with the landscape and the people, rather than it's some big idea invented in Westminster or some think tank, sorry Mark, which is going to solve everything. And that sort of soft, gentler, people-based story could be, I think, phenomenally politically attractive over the next few years.
Just on the specifics of the flag, because Starmer made a point about saying, people who, I can't remember the exact phrase, people who wince at the flag or something like this. Well, I wince at the flag. I'll be absolutely honest. If I'm walking through, sometimes I go and take my daughter to Rotherhithe to play football, and there's a flagpole in one of the gardens with a St George's cross on it, and I've got no idea who lives there. I've got no idea what it represents. But when I look at it, I kind of wince a bit, and I think, meh, it sends a bad signal, and that signal's been inculcated in me from growing up in the days when the National Front claimed that flag, and it was all about this skinhead kind of racist, fascist ideology that was represented by the flag. And I just wonder, is it wrong to wince at the flag still?
I mean, personally, I think it's sort of definitely not wrong to wince at those associations. So there was a period in time when, as you say, it was the skinheads and the National Front who grabbed hold of the flag, and it symbolised a very straightforward kind of white racism. And much of my childhood was spent in the same in that era. But I think it's what we're trying to say in the book is in the same way that England as a sort of identity or as a country isn't best represented or isn't at all represented by that. Neither need be the flag itself. And you've seen these moments in the last few decades where there have been sort of different variations of usages of the flag. So Tom can talk about the way in which the flag has shifted and changed in football, for example. But I always think most recently, just when we were thinking about the cover of the book, and we suggested having the flag or a version of the flag on the cover, and the few people we suggested that to were horrified because the flag has the same connotations for them as that you've described. And then I was walking through the Tube like the same day as that conversation, And the playwright James Graham had a play at the National Theatre called Dear England about the England football team.
Great.
Brilliant team.
Yeah.
Brilliant
play.
Yeah.
And the poster is a sort of 5-foot version of the flag with a little Gareth Southgate in the middle. And millions of people walking through the tube all day, every day, looking at the flag, looking at that symbol. And that's not accidental, I think, because what James is trying to do in the play, as he says, as the Gareth Southgate character says, he says, we've got to stop telling some stories and start telling new stories.
Right.
So you don't stop telling stories altogether, you start telling new ones. And as you do that, you take the symbols of the old stories and you give them new meaning. And I'm hoping that's what we can do with the flag as well.
And there are probably times when people, in the past, when people winced or thought it was a major talking point when they saw the first black newsreader.
Right.
Or the first black player to play for England. That was, Viv Anderson.
Yeah.
Huge news story.
Yeah.
Now we don't think anything more about it. There was a controversy when Keir Starmer started appearing on TV with a Union flag in the background. And lots of left-wing, but now no one mentions it anymore.
Yeah.
It's just like,
And of course, there was
that's what he does.
the storm about the bastardisation of the flag on the back of the shirt.
Yeah.
I think we've allowed certainly I think if you've taken the trouble to put a whole flagpole up in your front garden, that's probably quite strange behaviour still for me. But when more and more Labour MPs or Liberal MPs or Green MPs start actually adopting a flag like other countries do, centre-left politicians do in other countries, I think it will become normalised, and I think it's quite important. I don't think I don't think flag's just a symbol, but part of this book is not allowing just one version of Englishness to be told. There's a left-wing version of Englishness which is also rubbish. It goes about diggers and the Chartists and the suffragettes.
Billy Bragg.
It's usually about Billy Bragg. It usually ends with Billy Bragg singing a song about the miners. There isn't just one version, and we shouldn't let the flag be associated with just one version.
Yeah.
And I think when initially when Keir Starmer started doing clips for TV with a flag behind it, I thought it was strange. Now I think he was right.
Right.
I think we just need to normalise it on the centre-left again.
Can I ask about ordinariness again, the English ordinariness that runs through the book, like a river? Because you've both been speechwriters, comms strategists, you've been intimately involved in the day-to-day battle of language. And the truth is that the day-to-day battle of language now in politics is unbelievably turbocharged. It's riven by bombast. Everything during COVID was world leading, even when it barely existed. Social media requires a sort of violent brevity, and none of that is desirable. But how feasible is it to bring the Zeppelin down to earth? In terms of practical politics. For Starmer.
I think the truth is that it is flying in the face of a conventional wisdom. So there is a conventional political comms strategy wisdom, which is that you can't do complexity, you can't do nuance, you can't do shades of grey. You got to do
sound bites,
friend enemy,
vision. Find
the dividing lines, big visions, and everything.
Simplify and exaggerate.
Exactly, and everything in 3 words. Take back control. But I think our strong sense is that's let us down, like from all sides. So everyone who's tried to do that sort of false simplicity, big argument, divide the country in half and try and bash the other lot, have left us in a horrible mess, and Brexit is a perfect example of that, which is that it was just an untruth, dressed up as a big exciting story, which got some people's pulses racing, but is undeliverable because the complexity of real worlds doesn't allow us to do the kind of things that Boris Johnson and others promised that we could do. So I kind of think there's a political imperative to do subtlety and nuance because we can't solve the problems unless we do. But I'd also say that I don't think we are alone in this view. I mean, one of the things that I loved most when I was working with Ed Miliband in the old days is we flew over David Axelrod from America, and we didn't give him very much time or space to do anything. But one thing he did say all the time in the few meetings he was in, he says, "You guys want to talk sound bites and slogans all the time. Just let me talk in paragraphs."
Yeah.
And I thought that's essentially the insight. We're not
David Axelrod being Obama's great advisor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think it's in nuance and ambiguity. It's not just a recognition of what the country really is. I don't think most people could place themselves exactly on some ideological spectrum. Most people have much more ambiguity. Even Nigel Farage in our book, maybe he's trolling me somehow, but at the end of the interview, he said, what's his favourite place in England? He said London because I love the diversity.
That was brilliant.
Yeah. So, but there's something in this that as I've got older and hopefully wiser, I think I've learned that politics isn't about straight lines. It's not about cutting through that hillsides. It's about trying to find a way around it. And indeed, if you can recognise nuance and ambiguity, recognise those bends in the line, then you can actually find potential to find consensus with other people. Rather than saying they are the enemy, these are our friends, we're now going to go to a political war. All this language about dividing lines in politics. We should be looking for places where we can find unity and alliance, surprising unity and alliance, because that is almost the definition of how we make progress as a country.
There's just this wonderful sentence I'd actually transcribed because it was towards the end of the book. So you say the problem is this country is too large to hide away from the world, but also too small to change that world, which I thought was as good a kind of encapsulation of Britain's place, or England's place, I should say, in the world as I've read recently. And all right, maestros, how do we negotiate that moving forward? Because you're right, we can't retreat into a sort of bucolic stroke urban ordinariness which no one cares about, but we don't have the might that many people imagine in made up slogans like global Britain and so on. So wherein lies the nuanced, ambiguous answer? Is there an answer?
There's no one answer. There's lots of little answers. So if you look at how, if there is a Labour government, it would approach it subject of Europe. I think if they went in and said, right, we've got a big solution to this, we're going to go back in. Well, you're not going to do anything for 5 years then, apart from argue about Brexit again. And if you say, right, we're going to really make Brexit work, we're going to use our independence, well, you're going to fall flat in your face again like this government has. I think what you'll see is a sort of progressive incrementalism of step by step. Do you want to align? Yes. Do you want to align on a veterinary agreement, on visas, maybe
Youth
on data?
travel,
There are areas around sort of the carbon trading area, and slowly you're going to get closer. And it's bit by bit a picture emerges, because that's what a country like Britain needs to do.
So people no longer wince.
Yeah, and not to imagine that we can reclaim some imagined greatness from the past and that our future lies beyond Europe. It doesn't. It lies working with allies, quite difficult allies, and we're a difficult ally, and finding places where we can work together and make consensus. And we're going to need to do that in the next few years, not just on trade, but on security. How Europe comes together to find a proper security pact to deal with Russia, to deal with refugees, to deal with
Trump,
climate change, and to deal with Trump, because Europe could be fighting a war against Russia on its own in the next few years, and we haven't got a great record on that. And so the history doesn't say you're going to succeed. We've got to find a way.
Of Magna Carta again.
Well, we're going to need to find ways of working with our closest partners, and big myths about ourselves are going to get in the way.
So we need calm and muddle through,
and find that ambiguity, find those little chinks of space where we can make a consensus with people which we wouldn't normally expect.
Tom, Marc, thank you so much for coming in.
It's such an interesting
We could have gone on for hours and hours.
Really, really interesting.
Waving at us wildly, saying. Run out of time. But the book is on sale now. It's called England: 7 Myths That Changed the Country and How to Set Them Straight, by Tom Baldwin, Marc Stears. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.
Thank you
very
so much.
All the best with it. Thanks.
So, brilliant conversation. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Very, very good. We must get them back on.
Yeah, they were great.
Please, if you enjoyed the show, if you got any questions, get those into us. Any feedback to 2matts@tnepublishing.com. That's the number 2, MATTS @tnepublishing.com. Or if you listen on Spotify, you can message us there. And that's what Cool Garrow did, who says, I'm an ex-smoker, brackets glad to be, but it's not correct to say there are no mitigating factors to smoking. Many people get a self-medicated relaxation from cigarettes. What do you think about?
Well, I mean, the logic is unimpeachable, although it's also true of heroin.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure it's a very good way to approach life.
I don't know. So anytime you use the phrase self-medication, I think you have to question whether that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yes, I mean, self-medication, I'm not sure it's generally a good thing.
No, that's right. It's like citizen journalism and nobody talking about citizen dentists.
And Liz Truss.
It's like, no, exactly. Okay, well, anyway, thank you, Cool Garrow, for the question. And you can send in, if you're listening to this on Spotify, you can ask us any questions there, very simply indeed. We will have more questions on Sunday. Please remember our subscription offer. Head to theneweuropean.co.uk/2mats. That's the number 2, MATTS, and there's a link in the show notes. And if you subscribe, you can get that free Bollocks to Brexit passport cover just in time for your summer holidays. Thanks as ever to producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio with support from Ollie Peart. And until next week,
it's goodbye from me.
It's goodbye from him.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.